We are looking forward to having our guest today that's going to talk to us about some issues that are really sort of contemporary here in Florida right now. A Florida Gator, and I'm going to let Lisa do the introductions. And but we're very excited about having him on here, and we'll give him an opportunity to talk to you. And Dr. Smith, we'll look forward to you having an opportunity to take a few minutes and take a break and get to a certain point and let some people ask questions and so forth. So with that, let me turn it over to Lisa Lorenzo.
Yes, thank you. So, Dr. Smith, let me tell you a little about him. Daniel Smith is a professor and former chair of political science at the University of Florida. He's the president of Election Smith. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, undergraduate degrees in history, political science from Penn State. He's research focused on how institutions shape political behavior across the United States. He's authored 3 books and has over 100 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. He served as expert witness in numerous voting rights lawsuits across the country, working with organizations including the ACLU, the AACP, and the League of Women Voters. He's a recipient of numerous fellowships and grants, including service as a senior Fulbright scholar in Ghana, West Africa. Welcome, Dr. Smith.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. Everyone can hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Jennifer, for putting this together. I'm going to share my screen. I've got some slides to put together and share with you a little bit about some of the research I've done, but putting direct democracy, ballot measures, which you're all very familiar with, into some historical context. So let me see if I can share my screen and then click on to my presentation here. Let's see if this will work.
There you go.
Are you seeing the full slide?
Yeah.
All right, excellent.
Yeah.
So, I would echo, Kurt's comments. The polarization that's going on. It's one thing to disagree on principles and ideals. It's another to be doing anything with respect to violence. And our country certainly has had a history of both of those, and the latter is unacceptable. When you think about direct democracy, ballot measure, I'll talk a little bit about it. There are a lot of disagreements over direct democracy. But it really shouldn't be a partisan issue. It can be an ideological, philosophical issue of whether or not we are a purely representative system of government or one that allows for individuals to have a voice. What really it comes down to in terms of how direct democracy has flourished and been cracked down upon in the United States over the last 125 years, it's a matter of political control and political power. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of direct democracy, including in Florida. Talk a little bit about the ability of citizens to make choices on ballots, measures that come to them, as well as talk a little bit about issues and partisan politics in Florida, particularly in terms of these patterns that we see on voting for statewide candidates, as well as these issues that have been fairly controversial. So just a little background. This is just I grabbed these slides, snapshots from the web earlier this morning. If you really study these, you'll realize there's a lot of confusion in terms of what direct democracy actually is. And if you study this closely, you'll realize that there are some states that are colored in, like Louisiana in some slides and not, Wyoming in some slides and not. It's confusing. That's because direct democracy is really a bundle of issues that allow citizens to have a direct voice. It's not the only way citizens can have a direct voice, and I'm talking here outside of the representative function, but it's really an opportunity to either change statutes, change constitutional amendments, to challenge legislative laws that have been passed through what was called a popular referendum, but also the recall of officials. Florida, this dark blue color here, is one of only 3 states and one of only 2 that actually are using the initiative process only to allow citizens to directly amend the state constitution. There's no statutory option in Florida. If citizens want to place a measure on the ballot to prevent the gestating pregnant pigs in crates, they don't have a statutory option. It's only a constitutional option. Other states, all these that are in kind of the dark green color, at least on my screen, these 15 states, mostly in the West, but also Michigan, Ohio, and Massachusetts, allow citizens to have an option of initiating either amendments to the Constitution or state statutes. The light blue colored ones, these 6 states from Maine to Alaska, allow citizens to use the statutory measure. They also allow what is known as this veto referendum. Ballotpedia calls it. I call it a popular referendum. Again, if a state legislature passes a law, citizens can challenge that law at the polls, which is also in all those dark green states. They allow it as well, the darker color ones. New Mexico and Maryland only allow that veto referendum, that popular referendum. And then many of these states, not Florida, also allow the recall of public officials at the state level. We have that at the local level. Mississippi is interesting colored here because Mississippi currently doesn't allow the initiative process because of a peculiarity with respect to the number of congressional seats it's supposed to have when the law was passed and how many it has now. And we can talk about that later. Anyway, the question is, how did we get to this crazy patchwork of states? And this goes back to the history of the adoption of direct democracy that stretches back into the 1890s. So during the populist and then progressive era, starting around the 1890s through about 1920, you had 20 states that adopted direct democracy. And you can see from the dates that are down in the table here, sorry about the quality of that screenshot. That's from my first book, Tax Crusaders and the Politics of Direct Democracy. You can see that most of these states, up until 1918 in Massachusetts, 20 of the 24 states, adopted direct democracy during this period of time, 18 of the 20 states or so. But other states did so later. There was a whole constitutional question about whether or not states could even have direct democracy. Article 4, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution guarantees a Republican form of government. And yet, all the states after 1787, when they became admitted to the Union, had popular votes on becoming a state, including Florida. Florida in 1838 had for the first constitution, for statehood, it was a popular vote of the people to become a state. And actually, Congress in, I think it was 1857, made it a law that any new states coming in had to have actually a popular referendum, a plebiscite on to become a state. What's also, of course, true is that many states prior to the creation of the U.S. In 1787, 1789 had direct popular participation at the local level. And so some of you probably have come down from the Northeast, places like Connecticut, Massachusetts, that still have direct democracy in which budgets are passed by not elected representatives, but by citizens coming in and voting on these things. So we've had a long history of popular sovereignty with respect to voting on constitutional as well as statutory issues in this country. We saw this take off in the 1900s. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and as well as in Florida. Just so that you can put that question of, do we even have a guarantee of direct democracy at the state level with respect to the U.S. Constitution and Article 4, Section 4 that guarantees a Republican form of government? The U.S. Supreme Court settled that case back in a case in 1912. It said that it was a political question, the same kind of answer that the court has given in the last several years with respect to controversial issues. So there was a case that was brought in North Carolina by Common Cause challenging redistricting in North Carolina. And it went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was the Rucho decision, Rucho versus Common Cause in 2019. And in that decision, the conservative majority on the court said this is a political question. Partisan gerrymandering is allowed in North Carolina if the state constitution allows it. That's obviously different in Florida because of the Fair District Amendments. They're still on the books at the state level. Different questions at the congressional level, at the federal level. But this political decision that we're going to use this political question doctrine to defer to the states. And if the states want to add direct democracy, to their constitutions. They can do so. And in fact, Congress, one of the interesting things about the history, you have a couple states, Oklahoma coming into statehood in 1907, Arizona in 1911, that came into the Union with the initiative and referendum as part of their constitution. And Congress authorized that. Congress had to create enabling legislation for these two states to have referendums to adopt their constitution, and both of those states had the initiative and referendum, the popular referendum to challenge state laws, the constitutional as well as statutory amendments. So this question is really one that has been decided long ago. The courts have not taken this issue up with respect to direct democracy. It's settled law. States can adopt it. States don't have to adopt it. The question is, currently, and I'm not going to talk too much about that, but maybe in the Q&A, what happens if states want to start to take away the rights of citizens with respect to petitioning their government and putting measures on the ballot? That's a more complicated question with respect to, all right, a state gave you the power, how much can the state take back? And one of the first articles in the Florida state constitution is all power resides in the people. So it's not only federal, it's the state issue. Okay. What's interesting, though, with these adoptions, you see Florida is no longer colored here because Florida adopted the constitutional amendment to put initiatives on the ballot in the 1968 Constitution that was adopted. And I'll talk a little bit about the first initiative. But Florida didn't adopt early. And there are some states on here that currently have the initiative process that didn't adopt during that period of time. This movement, mostly in the West, was being pushed for both philosophic reasons as well as kind of practical politics. The philosophic ones were giving power to the people, that Republican government, small r Republican government, has failed. Party bosses controlling the system, gerrymandering, not representative. Florida, you can think about the pork chop gang. That was because we had one member guaranteed to the state legislature from every county. Clearly, as the growth was going down the southeast corridor and growth moving in the 1910s, 20s became very inequitable in terms of the power being held in mostly north central and the panhandle where it was less populated areas. So there were concerns about representation even back in the 1900s. These were more philosophical. They were coming from groups like the Direct Legislation League, taking inspiration from Switzerland that adopted direct democracy and still has. The cantons, the 27 cantons in Switzerland, still use direct democracy to make decisions. There's some great videos of looking at these cantons having these huge arenas where people will come in, file in, doesn't matter if they're usually outside, if it's raining or not, and then voting on various issues directly as opposed to having representative government. So there was a philosophic push for this. You can think about people like William Jennings Bryan, the Democrat who ran as a populist for a couple of the times that he ran for president, I think 3 times, 1896, 1900, 1908. Failed Democratic candidate, but he had kind of populist bona fides. He really pushed for direct democracy. He was from Nebraska originally. His cousin was actually governor of Florida around this time. William Sherman Jennings was elected in 1900. And William Jennings Bryan would come down and actually campaigned for his cousin and wrote a very long report that was filed in the legislative um, readings for why Florida should adopt direct democracy. That was in 1907, I think. So there was that philosophic, but there was also a very strong um, push by various groups that were single issue or multiple issue, but narrower type of practical politics, that they were being stymied in state legislatures by the powers that be, the party bosses, but also the corporate interests. There were growing class divisions in the 1890s. This is this um, the Gilded Era that we can see coming out of. There was a concentration of wealth with these oligopolies with railroads and mining. Tramways were a big one as well. And so there were organized groups that were pushing against this. You had groups that were pushing for temperance. They didn't like the fact that some states had alcohol being sold all the time. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union was one of the biggest national organizations in 1900. They had presence in all the states, and they were pushing to try to have, because they were failing at the local level with all these different rules on alcohol, they wanted to have it at the state level. So they were pushing for direct democracy to put an initiative on the ballot to have prohibition. The National American Women's Suffrage Association looking for initiatives to be able to put for women's suffrage because it wasn't going through many state legislatures, which are by definition being controlled by men. Farmer organizations, particularly in the Midwest, were very much advocates with the populace for direct democracy because they were being killed off by the monopolistic railroads to get their grains or their products to places like Chicago. So the Grange, the Farmers Union, both pushing for that specific issues to break the monopoly power of corporations. The Socialist Party, Eugene Debs ran for president in 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912. I think one of those years from prison and gained over 1 million votes. He was pushing for direct democracy, this radical leftist, Marxist, socialist. We've heard that trope right now. This guy was pushing for an 8-hour workday, no child labor laws, minimum wage, safety regulations, insurance policies. These radical ideas that the powers that be didn't want to do, he was pushing the initiative process because he knew that if it could get to the ballot, he would be successful. The median voter was very different than the median voter of the state legislature. And that actually continues today. We'll see that in a bit. So there were also reformers. We have the secret ballot, largely because of the initiative process. There's no guarantee to the right of privacy to vote. Antonin Scalia, I was in a Supreme Court argument because I was an author of an amicus brief in this case called Doe v. Reed, and Antonin Scalia asked Jim Bopp, a conservative lawyer who's actually a UF Gator, Mr. Bopp, is there a guarantee to the right to privacy for a secret ballot? And Jim Bopp had to say, well, no. There's a penumbra that kind of protects it, but it really comes from direct democracy pushing for the Australian ballot to make a secret ballot, to government reform to break up the party bosses, the boss tweeds of the Democratic Party in New York, pushing for direct primaries for who's going to be nominated. So when Kurt Kelly ran for office, he had to run in a primary. In the past, it was the party boss that said, Mr. Kelly, we'd like to have you serve next. So it's because of direct democracy that we have direct primaries. We have directly the direct election of U.S. senators. It was actually called the Oregon system because Oregon was one of the first states to adopt direct democracy and was the first to actually put on the ballot for citizens to say, no, we actually want to send our U.S. senators by popular vote, not by what the legislature is doing. And then the other states followed, and then finally Congress acted with the 17th Amendment that went for ratification. Women's suffrage. moving through the initiative. So there are a lot of different groups that were pushing for direct democracy, and they were having success one-off in various states. Um, the populists were these are kind of populist groups, with the exception of the government reform. They were more in the progressive era, and the progressives, there was an elitism, there was a protectivism, there was a the progressives were not as progressive on a lot of different issues. They didn't like the fact that the party machines were being dominated by these Irish and Italian Catholics coming in who didn't know the language, who were just voting the party machine. And so the progressives were this northeastern elite, waspish, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant that wanted people to actually know how to vote on candidates, not have the parties tell them to do. And so there were these, what I'm trying to present here is there were a lot of mixed motives of pushing for direct democracy at this time. It wasn't just left and right, and it wasn't Republican and Democrat. There were Democrats that were pushing for it and Republicans for pushing for it. Teddy Roosevelt becomes prominent after he steps down after that full term and lets his vice president, William Howard Taft, become elected. He comes back in 1908 to run as a progressive, the Bull Moose candidate ticket, right? And his number one platform was, we need to have initiative referendum across the country. Taft was, appalled by it. And the other funny thing is Woodrow Wilson, who becomes elected in 1912, Wilson is an elitist coming from Virginia, this Democrat. He becomes a professor at Johns Hopkins of political science. He becomes the president of Princeton. He writes this treatise on constitutional government. He hates the initiative process. He thinks the citizens don't have the ability to participate in a knowledgeable way, that it should be elites that are like himself making these decisions. And then he runs for president in 1912. And guess what religion he discovered? The religion of direct democracy. When he was campaigning out west, he said, the initiative process is a states' right issue, and you should have the right to do this, he said in 1911 in Colorado, right after Colorado in 1910 adopted direct democracy. He was all in. When he went back to his home in Virginia and was campaigning in the South, he said, no, this is a states' rights issue. You don't have to have direct democracy if you want. So it was a very practical thing this Democrat was doing because he realized he was being outmaneuvered by TR on this. And there were major splits in the party. The Republican Party in California just splintered because Hiram Johnson, who runs for governor in 1910, is a bull moose progressive. He actually campaigned. He was being considered to run as vice president with TR in 1912. He pushed for it, and the Stand Pat Republicans said, we don't want direct democracy. The party actually split and allowed for a lot of Democrats to move in and position themselves, even though they're in the minority, to play out to the median voter, the voter who supported direct democracy. So it was a fascinating time. A lot of controversy, ideological, principled, but also real, interests with respect to substantive interests. And obviously, on the flip side, the interests that want to maintain control over the state legislature. All right, I've gone on way too long for that. What's interesting is that Florida actually had, you can't read this down here, it's 1911. Florida in 1911, actually, the legislature passed a joint resolution. It's dominated by Democrats. I don't think there was a single Republican in 1911 in Florida legislature. But there were some divisions in terms of the growing population on the southeast and that in the north, in the Panhandle. But during this period of time, Florida, and I have this, here it is. Florida actually passed this HJR 2222 in 1911, both chambers, supermajorities needed to put this on the ballot. And the constitutional amendment that was going to go to the voters in 1912 would have said that the first power reserved to the people is the initiative, and 20% of the legal voters shall have the right to propose any legislative measure. 25% shall have the right to propose any amendments to the Constitution. So they were falling in line with all of these other states, even though the Florida, government was not really that progressive. Certainly on race, it was not. Jim Crow South was very much in place. But they were getting pressure from a lot of agrarian interests and others for the same monopoly powers like, you know, Flagler with his railroads and a monopoly in terms of how to get up and down the state or over to Key West. And the other industrialists, Broward, who was the governor right before this time, he stepped down in 1909, wanted to drain the swamp, wanted to drain the Everglades completely for more development. And there were a lot of interests that didn't want that. So this was on the ballot. It turned out that it was not put on the ballot because of legislative challenge by a very conservative Democratic governor, Albert Gilchrist, you know about Gilchrist County, and did not want to see that on the ballot. The Democratic Secretary of State, Clay Crawford, and the Attorney General, Park Trammell, who ended up becoming governor in 1912, they both wanted this to go through. I think Trammell probably wanted it because he was running for governor and he wanted to have kind of the populist support for this. Tried to do it, but the Supreme Court said no, there were some procedural problems, and the measure never got placed on the ballot. So, you know, in subsequent years, the legislature again passed in one chamber or the other legislation to move forward, but it never got on the ballot. So it's not until 1968 that we have this. All right, that was a lot. I'm going to try to go through this next part quickly and then give you some data that I've just been developing with one of my grad students, which I think is pretty fun to look at. All right. There's a lot of concern of whether voters can vote correctly on ballot measures. I wrote my first book was pretty critical of direct democracy, Tax Crusaders and the Politics of Direct Democracy, focused on these tax limitation measures and the kind of populist tropes that were being used, including here in Florida by a guy named David Bidoff in the 1990s, where we put tax limitation measures on the ballot, which were successful. Second book is called Educated by Initiative, and that book is more positive with respect to looking at citizens who are in states that use the initiative process, have higher turnout, they have higher political knowledge, they engage in groups more often, they think about politics through the lens of some of these issues. You might agree or disagree with those issues, but you're thinking about them and you're attaching them and becoming more civically engaged. So the studies that have done this, and I've done some of these as well, there's very little evidence that voters can't vote correctly. And what I mean correctly is not whether it's normatively what ought to be. That's in the eye of the beholder. But are they consistent? Do they vote for issues that are more liberal or more conservative, that are consistent with their own political views and partisan views? And the book that I wrote, this is now 20 years ago, was when the book came out. I found that there was a real adherence to people who voted on liberal issues, were supporting Democratic candidates, people voting conservative issues, were voting for Republicans. The parties were really good at being able to poll and use those issues to differentiate themselves. And again, we were not nearly as polarized then, so parties were trying to polarize and move people to popular issues. What you will see in some of the evidence is that's not necessarily the case anymore, but voters use shortcuts. You know, when you go into the grocery store and need a tube of toothpaste, you're going to get Crest or Pepsodent or Colgate, and you are not going to read all the labels on that, even though they might be a little different. You're going to use some heuristic, some cue that's going to say, hey, the kids like this, or my spouse likes this, or I've not ever had a cavity using this. I'm going to stick with this. I'm not going to, no matter that, what is that, gel? What was the one that was very popular? AIM. You know, this big advertising. Yeah, well, that's a little risky. I'm going to stick with what I go with. And so that's how voters think about issues. The information they get may be skewed one way or the other, but they're able to really figure things out pretty well on a lot of these issues of whether they're kind of consistent with their own normative judgments, their ideology, or maybe their partisan preferences. Now, this has been going on for a long time. They use these cues. And this is a ballot. I don't know if you can see this, but it's insane. This is the 1914 ballot in California. And I came across this when I was doing archival work in Stanford back in 2006. And I haven't done anything with it, but it's crazy. Direct democracy was adopted in 1911. The first measures on the ballots from citizens were in 1912. There were only 3. In 1914, there were 48 measures on the ballot. This, when you open this up, it was like a baby bed sheet. And, people had to vote on these things. And you think, how the heck can they vote on these issues going down, yes or no? They had to vote on, candidates. It wasn't a party line vote. Progressive had already made this into a office block ballot, so you couldn't vote a party line vote. So progressives were saying, if you want to vote for Secretary of State, you got to know who these people are. Local offices didn't have parties. They became nonpartisan. Again, a progressive effort to try to take some of the party boss control out. If you blow this thing up in terms of looking at these 48 issues, um, I think there were 10 that were initiated by citizens. And some of them were like number 2, prohibition. There's another one that I don't think I have in here, number 47, which is down this way, which was also prohibition. They were both put on by the Women's Christian Temperance Union to get alcohol out of the homes and stop destroying their husbands. But there was also an effort to suspend any possibility of a prohibition should it get on the ballot and succeed. So the liquor industry was already figuring this out. They put a measure on, which was measure 39 on here, the suspension of prohibition measure, right? So there was already kind of this gaming of the system. 2 measures that were both slightly different on prohibiting alcohol, one that was going to flip it over. And you would think, how are these voters making these decisions? If you actually look at it, prohibition, prohibition, both were defeated, both really similar votes, really far away on the ballot. The one that was put on by the alcohol industry to suspend any possibility of these measures, should they go through, passed. So again, this is 1914, 48 measures that you have to figure out. And if you look at the votes cast, they're actually, less voted on this one, but in the kind of similar measures, right? So there's some type of pattern of recognition and obviously the lobbying that's going on, the information through newspapers and through pamphlets. And I found a ton of those things. I've had my students go through this stuff in the 1910s, and it's really remarkable. All right, here's what many of you might be interested in. Florida's historical usage of the initiative process. Okay. Ruben Askew is here pushing, as many of you know, the first initiative on the ballot, which was also successful, 1976 initiative for the Sunshine Amendment, which still is on the books. It's been carved back in many ways by the legislature in various areas, but full disclosure. And we still have very good disclosure laws in Florida. Campaign finance, even for initiatives, is one of the most transparent across the states. These measures were passing and failing. They were liberal and conservative measures. Term limits put on people like Kurt Kelly. You can leave office, you can come back, but that wasn't the case. Even under the 1968 Constitution revisions, term limits weren't there. So it was put on the ballot by conservatives. Why did conservatives put it on the ballot? Because Democrats were dominating the state legislature. And so this was for partisan purposes, but it was also principled, right? And it can be both of these things. And you're not going to pass a term limits measure in a state that's dominated by Democrats in 1992 unless you have support of independents, no party affiliates, as well as Democrats themselves. So it was the principled argument that was being made, even though there was a partisan reason behind it. This was part of a national effort in the late 1980s, early 1990s by term limits groups to break the hold by one party because of successive terms. It wasn't until these measures that all passed in the early 2000s, the bullet train that Paula Doherty's husband, who just passed away last year, I think, had self-financed to put on the ballot. Something that we're already kind of seeing now with the new train going from Orlando down to South Florida. The statewide smoking ban. the pre-education, the class size reduction, pregnant pigs, which I've already mentioned. It's arguable that none of these should be in the state constitution, but it's also undeniable that the state legislature had an opportunity to consider and did and make changes to these statutorily, and they didn't do it. So the safety valve, when Woodrow Wilson was campaigning in 1911, he said, the initiative referendum is the gun behind the door. It's a mighty good persuader. It shouldn't be used, but it's a mighty good persuader on state legislature. And in this case, it was used by these organizations, by these individuals, to do things that they were getting stymied every year in legislation. So whose fault is it that we have these in the Constitution? One could argue that it's actually the state legislature. If you have super majorities in these cases, the smoking ban, 71%, and yet the lobby of the tobacco industry was preventing that from being passed. There is no doubt to any of that. The other ones passed with not super majorities. And of course, this then made the movement towards 2004 and then 2006 when it was on the ballot to have the threshold go from 50% to a 60% plus one, which we all have now. All right, last couple slides, I promise. You're not going to be able to see this. This is all the measures going from after Reuben Askew's Citizen Initiative in 1976. Overall, 33 of the 44 citizen initiatives have passed, and that doesn't include these three. Actually, it's four. Typo there. Four in which we've had a majority vote, but not a supermajority vote after 2006. That includes the initial medical marijuana. It includes a measure to have all voters, not just a closed primary system for anyone voting in a primary who wants to, including no party affiliates. And then the last two measures, which we know had around 57%, but didn't get to the 60% threshold, the reproductive right measure and the personal use for marijuana. Okay, let's look at these patterns. I think this is pretty interesting. Is this going up okay on your screens? All right.
Yeah. Yes, good.
Okay. So what this is taking precincts. So we have 4,500 or so precincts in Florida. And it's a lot of data work to take precinct level results and match them up with the voter file, which I'm doing for other type of things because precinct names don't match. This is taking a look at the precinct results. So it's not normalized with respect to not all these precincts are the same size. So don't take this to look at the actual vote total, but you can see the precinct level totals on the x-axis, which is the bottom axis for the vote for the Republican candidate running statewide, top of the ticket, and the conservative support for the ballot measure. So I want to kind of keep it simple. It's not that simple, but trying to keep it simple, where we're looking at Republican vote share for the Republican candidate, the vote share for the Republican candidate, and the vote share for, in most of all of these cases except one, the no vote on the measures, because Republicans are controlling the state legislature. Almost by default, initiatives are going to be more left-leaning. As I was just saying, who controls the agenda? Who's going to try to circumvent the agenda? So let's take a look at this one. This has two measures on the ballot. One of them passed, Amendment 1, which is a land conservation measure, and one was the first round of medical marijuana that did not pass, the orange line. And you can think about this if Rick Scott, he did, he won a little over around 48% of the vote against Charlie Crist in that election. That's his vote share, that horizontal line that's dashed. And if you go up to the intersection with the 45-degree line, the dashed line, that is where his support and the support for the opposition for the constitutional amendments, since they're both more liberal, should have been, right? But you can see that both of these lines at that 48% are the orange and the yellow are below. And the blue line is well below. And that's because the no vote was very small on this conservation measure. I don't remember what Rick Scott's position was on the conservation measure. but it passed with 75% of the vote. Rick Scott, in that precinct would have, with that one in that average, that median precinct of 48%, would have had voters voting about, uh, what would that be? 78% support, right? So there's a disconnect. And if you go all the way up here to the right-hand side, where Rick Scott is winning, say, 85% of the vote at the precinct level, so you take all the precincts, here's the average of those precincts, the measure was still getting around 55% of the vote. Only 45% was no. All right, does that make sense in terms of thinking about this? The marijuana measure at that time, you could see that there was a lot less enthusiasm in some of these precincts where Scott did well. But still, even where Scott won on average the 48%, his support was considerably less than the support, which was 60% for the marijuana measure. And I think that's probably what drove the supporters to try again and maybe try in a general election. All right, a couple last slides. This is 2016. Solar energy didn't pass, and you can see there was actually a lot of opposition. This is a more liberal measure. It's failing it's not failing overall on average, but you can see that it's actually the places that didn't vote for Trump that has support, and it was the places that had support for Trump. I haven't been able to figure this one out, but that dotted blue line, right, where Trump won 10% of the vote, voters were still over 60% in support for this measure. It would have passed. But you look over here where Trump won 90% in those precincts, they were also really close to the 60%, just shy of 60%, right? So it's an issue that was put on by, groups that wanted to decentralize and allow homeowners to use solar energy. It was opposed, obviously, by the big industry, Power and Light, Florida Power and Light. And, are voters confused on this? They certainly didn't vote along partisan lines on this, but Trump also didn't run on this. So it's an interesting one. Amendment 2 in this time does pass, right? And you can see this line doesn't come anywhere close to the 45-degree, the orange line. It is winning over 60% on average in every precinct, except when you get up to 92, 93% for Trump. Then it's not doing as much, right? So there was clear support for this. I mean, where Trump wins 49% of the vote on average, the average across these precincts is like, what would that be? 73% support. So again, a disconnect. This goes against the work I was doing 20 years ago when I saw a convergence of parties and issues. And the way I would describe it to reporters when asked about this, I said, well, voters are getting their cake and they're eating it too. They can vote for a certain set of issues that they like or don't like, and they can vote for a candidate that they like or don't like. And those issues haven't been tied as closely as they used to be. And I'm not sure what's driving that, but it's a fascinating thing. And it's hard to then say that initiatives are a liberal or conservative issue. It's hard to say it's a partisan issue when you have liberals and conservatives supporting this. Sorry. All right, last couple, and I'm going to get to this is looking at felon voting rights, right?
You've got about 3 minutes, so let's.
I'm going to finish up in 2 minutes.
All right, there you go.
All right. So you can see the felon voting rights. Again, DeSantis wins less than 50% of the vote. On average, it was about 60-some% that supported restoration of voting rights. And we know what happened afterwards with respect to that amendment. But I'm going to skip to 2024 and focus on both, this. Do voters really know, right? So this was a poll that was done by Axios, and 64% of Floridians said they were familiar. This was back in April of 2024. And when asked, do you want to make abortion legal upon fetal viability, 57% of registered voters said yes. 6% said they weren't unsure. What was the vote? 57%. I mean, it was remarkable on how constant and consistent that was. Voters understood the measure. They had all kinds of money on both sides being spent on it. Um, and Yet it kind of reflected public opinion. Should it have become constitutional? Well, certainly if it was a 50% threshold, but it's not. That's a different question, right? But interesting. And here's the breakdown. Both these measures fail. That's the dotted lines. But you can see these actually hewed much more closely to the partisan vote. And so this paper I'm working on with Abida Sultana, one of my grad students, is trying to look at this partisan, are we coming back to more partisan polarization on these issues with candidates? And so you can see that, where Trump did well, the measure did not do well. The conservative support, the no vote was much higher. Okay, that's what I got. Sorry about the slow start. I had the wrong link.
Hey, and let me just say to everybody, we've got time for just a couple of questions, but let me encourage. Wow, I mean, I'm a political science guy, so this was awesome for me. But
Hmm.
go ahead and open up to real quick, like any questions anybody has.
Daniel, I'm gonna take a personal privilege and say I wonder if you looked at, because in Florida we have a strong libertarian bent too, on both conservative and liberal side of the political aisle, and I wonder if that would, if you controlled for that, if that would shift your outcome of your scatter plot graph.
Yeah, it's tough to get at that, obviously, with voter file data. And most voters are not registered with the Libertarian Party. They're registered as either
Right.
Republicans or Democrats. I lived in Colorado. There was a huge libertarian streak on both sides of the political divide there, and that explained a lot of the deregulation that was going on in the 1990s when I was living out there and teaching. I do have Abida is working on a different part where we're actually merging in the voter file, and so we can pull out some of the type of race and ethnicity, gender, age, and look at this. And one of the things we're finding is certainly in the Hispanic areas that there was much more opposition to Amendment 4, the
Mhm.
abortion rights measure, even controlling for support for Trump. So, I'm not sure about if I can get to the ideological side of this, libertarianism, but we can certainly see using the voter file data, this other type of information. Again, that's a tough join with respect to who voted, what their race, ethnicity, age, party is, but it's something that she's developing for her dissertation.
Cool. Thank you. Anybody else? Kurt, I'll turn it back.
I
Yeah.
was going to say, anybody else have a question? I didn't
Oh, I
see any
saw there's
hands
some
there.
chat here. I just saw the chat here.
Well,
Yeah, yeah.
I
Go ahead.
I had a quick question. People tend to believe that these ballot initiatives are used as um voter turnout drivers. Do you find that they are good at turning out voters to the polls?
So I missed the very first part of that.
He said
Uh,
the initiatives are used for voter turnout. That was his point.
Yeah, so I mean, the book that I wrote, one of the chapters is, and you can see in the back, is Educated by Initiative when it was being publicized by University of Michigan Press. Um, Really, it's very clear that initiatives can drive turnout. I have a paper that I'm working on with some undergrad students at UF. Uh, One worked for Kat Kamick. One is an abortion rights supporter, worked for Planned Parenthood, and the other is a Jewish kid from Central Florida. I have no idea what his politics are. But the four of us have been working for the last 7 months on pulling together data nationwide because there were 10 states that had reproductive rights measures on the ballot. And we were really interested in the question, did this lead to higher turnout? Well, the problem is identifying that causal mechanism because most of the states that had the measures on the ballot were states that were battleground states. And the reason they were on the ballot was because the proponents wanted to drive turnout, especially of younger women who they thought were concerned about what was going on with reproductive rights across the states. So far, we're finding just the smallest little evidence of that, but not very much. And it's partly because it's difficult to identify at the precinct level. And do you match precincts across state borders, counties across state borders? You can't just match states across borders because that makes no sense. You have to look at the historical trends about turnout. But generally, the literature has been ballot measures give people another thing to think about and drive them to the polls. So yes, that has been established. I wrote about that back in 2001, one of my first academic papers in this area. And people have thrown a lot of mud at it, but it still is sticking, those findings.
Wow. So I wish we had more time. First of all, for our lunch and learn, it's an hour, and just thank you. I'd love to have greater conversation and open it up for us. We might have to have you back and do something like this as we go. I think it's a question of we're going to see some other things that are coming in the future. And I can speak from a former legislator perspective. I understand the role of the representative form of government, and I mean, our founding fathers clearly was not interested in a pure democracy. They wanted the representative form of government. But I also see that there's checks and balances to the inactions, and having monolithic power bases that control people to get elected. And so I think there is value. And I think you're right. It's not a left or a right, although it can be used by the left or the right. So you've been awesome. Dr. Smith, thank you. I appreciate it. I'm political science from Florida State University, and it was back in the 80s when we had an outstanding school back then. I don't know where it is now.
It's a great university, great political
Yeah,
science department. I've
yeah,
got a lot of very good friends there. Yep.
and this was the kind of things that in our classes we would have these conversations that made you begin to think of how this moves public policy and all of these things. And just I had some awesome professors as well. Thank you so much. I know our group would all give you applause. Lisa, you have raised your hand, and I know we need to mention something about a survey we have. Go ahead.
There's a survey that we just dropped in the chat. If you guys would just take 1 minute and complete that quickly. Go ahead with your closing, Kurt.
All right. Well, that's it. That is the
I just
close.
didn't want them to miss the opportunity, for us to miss the opportunity to get some feedback really quick.
And the survey also speaks to what you want to see in the future. So if you want to weigh in on what our programming looks like in the future, fill it out. Thanks, y'all.
And if you
Dr.
would,
Smith.
Dr. Smith, if you wouldn't mind sending your deck to Lorianne, then we'll go ahead and forward that to everybody in the newsletter next month so they have access to that.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
And I do want us to have further conversations, and I would like the opportunity to expand even into some of your classroom stuff at times. There's an opportunity just to talk. We've done a lot of stuff around that. So
That's
again,
great.
thank you. To me, this was very exciting. I didn't know exactly, and I know that we forced you to rush through your process, but thank you. And on behalf of the Florida Sunshine Network and what we do here of Sunshine 100, we really appreciate you.
Great.
With that,
Well,
guys,
organizations like
everybody,
that.
thank you for your engagement. And we look forward to seeing you next month as we talk about political violence. So, and by the way, Dr. Smith, you're invited to be a part of this. So anytime you want to, we'll send you some information.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you. God bless. Thank you, Dr. Smith. Appreciate you so much.
Dr. Smith.